I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability, as well as its robust interior, are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network. Today on the James Altucher Show.
You know, showbiz, and not to be cliche or stereotype, but you've got, in many cases, a lot of ambitious, competitive, eccentric people. You put them in a room and give them a deadline, and that can, lead to a lot of clashes. And one of the things people make fun of about Jon Stewart in the book, people who worked with him at The Daily Show, is he would wear the same thing in the office every day. You know, a pair of work boots, a pair of chinos, same T-shirt, same Mets hat. And while they, rag him about essentially being a slob, there was, not to get cheaply psychological, also something Jon was communicating in that he was simplifying a lot of the extraneous stuff and getting to work. He was showing up at 9 every day, ready to work.
It wasn't about, quote unquote, the trappings of show business. It was about, today is today, and what was in the news, and what's funny about it, and what's our point of view, and so on.
Exactly. Steve Carell did a famous piece on the Straight Talk Express bus with John McCain in the 99 campaign. And he asked a series of really softball questions, what kind of tree would you be, that kind of thing. And McCain, who's got a sense of humor, plays along. And then Carell asks a policy question. He says, you're a strident opponent of pork barrel spending, yet when you headed the Senate Commerce Committee, you dedicated more money to individual districts and pork barrel projects than anyone in history. And McCain freezes. There's a real deer in the headlights moment, which Carell bursts by saying, I don't even know what those words mean. And they go back to laughing.
Well, okay, in that part, I highlighted that exact story in the book because what if he did not pull back from it? So I'm just curious, I always think, so this is an oral history of The Daily Show, and just before the podcast starts, I always think people must think these are easy books to write because it's like other people are giving you the words and you're just going around and collecting the words. But I imagine it must be incredibly difficult to get the 60 or so people you got to tell a story that has an arc to it.
Yes, and I don't know how I say it without patting myself on the back, but it was hard. I'd never done it before. The deadline was crazy short. I started in September of 2015.
Oh, hold on a second. I want to make
Sure.
sure actually we're capturing it. Started in September 2015.
Yeah.
Just like yesterday.
Yeah, John, they didn't want me doing any of the reporting, interviewing until he'd left the show officially. So I started in 2015.
Which makes
September
sense, I guess. He doesn't want people like to flavor his last few months, like if somebody didn't like
Exactly.
him or whatever.
Exactly. And he was and is incredibly careful, respectful of not getting in Trevor Noah's way.
Uh-huh.
You know, he likes Trevor a lot, and he didn't, obviously John's exit was going to overshadow it regardless, but he didn't want, this book in some minor way interfering with Trevor's launch or with all the people who stayed from John's staff, who had a very busy transition in getting the new show up and running. So started September 2015. The original deadline was April 2016. So essentially, what is that, 7 months?
Yeah.
I get to April. I meet all the deadlines. The book's in pretty good shape. And the publisher says, we knew this was unrealistic all along. Keep going. Which was fine because the extra time was very helpful.
But then the turnaround time between the time you finished the book and the time it was published was very short.
Yes. Technology, whatever, they're able to actually do the mechanical stuff faster all the time. The final rewriting was early October. The book came out November 22nd.
Oh, yeah, because there was stuff even from like a few weeks ago
Exactly.
in the book.
Yeah. But to backtrack, I did slightly more than 200 interviews because some people I interviewed more than once. There are 114 different people quoted in the book. And assembling it in some semi-coherent narrative was really difficult.
And it's not like everybody had the same cohesive view of the show and Jon Stewart. You had people who were angry at each other in this book.
Yes, and I wanted it to be warts and all, as the publisher certainly did. People, it was never going to be an SNL oral history. There was not nearly enough sex and drugs and death in the Daily Show experience. But there were people who got on each other's nerves. It's smart, opinionated people. There was fights, substantive fights, personality differences, and people were pretty blunt about that.
Yeah,
and
sure. There was, you had Louis Black, Madeline Smithberg,
right?
All these people going back and forth on each other, with their own resentments and their own kind of grievances.
Yeah, and there's that part of it, people being honest and upfront. But I mean, as a writer, the thing you said that's been in some of the reviews that makes me really happy is the book seems conversational. Even though I did more than 200 discrete interviews, you have people in a dialogue a back and forth.
I was curious about that, and we'll get into the weeds of that. I just want to introduce you as Chris Smith, who wrote an excellent book, which I've already even recommended in my book club. But it's The Daily Show, the book, an oral history of the show. It was a great book. Jon Stewart does the introduction. Chris, how's it going?
Excellent. Thank you for having me.
It's basically, as you said, you interviewed 114 people, including a lot of interviews with Jon Stewart.
Correct.
About kind of the rise from 1990. When did it start? 1996?
The show itself started in 1996 with Craig Kilborn as host, and he was in charge 2.5 years, and Jon Stewart took over January 99.
And your book pretty much focuses on the Jon Stewart year. I mean, it pretty much only focuses on the Jon Stewart years. You have an intro with Craig you have how it began and the Craig Kilborn, but you're focusing on several things which I think are interesting that I want to ask you about each one. One is kind of the rise of or really the full expression of Jon Stewart's amazing talent, because I don't think before the Daily Show, everybody had a sense this guy is a great comedian, and he had kind of a cult following on his MTV show. He had a further cult following. I was at HBO when he was on the Larry Sanders Show, and
terrific.
I even did the Larry Sanders website back in like 1996 or 7 or whatever. And Jon Stewart was always. that was a great show because it was as if it was a real talk show, but it was behind the scenes.
Yes.
And Jon Stewart often played the guest host on Larry Sanders' talk show. Yeah. And so you got a sense of how he would be as a talk show host.
Yeah.
And so you kind of had the sense, who's going to give this guy finally a chance? So then you see Comedy Central and The Daily Show gave him a chance, but no one knew, even he didn't know if he would fail or not. He'd already failed at a couple of different things. His movies were mediocre. We all knew he was talented, but no one knew how much. And so there was that. Then there was the rise of this show as a platform for talent, where you had Steve Carell, Stephen Colbert, Samantha Bee, so many other people. And then finally, you kind of, you described the story of how late night or how the Daily Show redefined late night and the role of comedy in news reporting. Mm-hmm. And I think, so these three stories sort of interweave together throughout the book, and it's very interesting.
Man, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because while, I don't know, 70% of the people are Daily Show staff, writers, producers, performers, Jon Stewart, I really one of my goals was really to connect the book, the internal parts of how the Daily Show was made, to the context of the times. I mean, we all lived through it, so we know about this. But one of the fun or interesting realizations I came to in reporting the book was, can we curse on your podcast?
Yeah. Everything goes.
Is just how much shit happened in the world between 1999 and 2015.
For a show then that was getting closer and closer to being kind of this quasi-news show, how do they insert comedy into the shitstorm that was happening, whether it was 9/11 or the financial crisis, or like, given that the bias of the Daily Show was kind of, let's call it New York liberal Democrat, how do you be funny in a Barack Obama administration? That's almost as much a challenge.
Yes, and those are a lot of threads that people talk about within the book. Starting somewhat at the beginning, yes, you're exactly on target. And there's a quote from Jon in the book where he says, in retrospect, people say, oh yeah, of course, Jon Stewart in The Daily Show was going to work. But a lot had to go right. A lot was luck. A lot was hiring the right people. A lot was tremendous hard work on the part of Jon and, dozens of other people.
Well, let's start with there, because I think, and this is not a slight against Craig Kilborn. He does fine.
Different guy.
He's done fine since then. He, in the Daily Show format was just starting. He probably didn't really know what to do with it. It had a very small audience. So it was a little, and you even described it was a little sillier. It was more of like, let's do pretend news as if we were a news show and we'll make it silly. Jon, bit by bit, and we could kind of go through it bit by bit, he changed it to being this very insightful, interesting show about hypocrisy, not only in the subject matter, which are the news that's happening, but hypocrisy among the media that covers that subject matter. Hypocrisy in the media itself.
Exactly.
And using the format of like, he started off with the Bush versus Bush, where you have kind of like video of Bush here and video of Bush 4 years earlier saying completely opposite things and debating. But then he took that in the media and constantly, and just like, well, did the media really say this? And you have all the media saying the exact opposite.
Yep.
So again, how did Jon Stewart himself evolve? Why was he the perfect choice for this? Tell us about Jon Stewart and his talent.
Sure. He's a guy who, had a sort of upper middle-ish class upbringing in New Jersey, went to William & Mary, kind of came into comedy sideways. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to do after college. And
was he stand-up first? I actually don't remember.
Yes. And then, as a lot of comics do, wrote for other shows and other people, had a eventually pretty successful stand-up career going. Had a couple of gigs hosting.
Oh, yeah, he was on Letterman.
Yeah. A show called Short Attention Span Theater that was on MTV briefly, then the Jon Stewart Show, which is where I first wrote about him and got to know him a little bit.
Right, I read that article. So just to mention, you've been following him for 22 years. Like that article was 1994.
Right, exactly. And I met, Jon Stewart in 1993, and I said, there's a great book in this guy in 23 years. No.
Well, okay, but think about it. 1993 was kind of like an interesting year in comedy. You have all these comics that were beginning this alternative comedy scene. Not only Jon Stewart, but obviously Louis C.K. was beginning around then. Mark Maron.
Yep.
Janine Garofalo was, I
Yep.
think, maybe already starting to be in movies then. Yeah, Reality Bites was filmed around then.
She was on SNL briefly in that stretch. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was kind of this generation's now mainstream comics started then.
Yeah.
So again, what did you see in Jon Stewart that you didn't see necessarily in the others?
Well, a couple of things, and I should have made this plain in the book. I tried hard to get Craig Kilborn to talk to me. He wouldn't, declined politely. He's pretty much never talked about his Daily Show experience. I did get some other key people, Liz Winstead, Madeline Smithberg, who were the co-creators of the show, and they talked about something interesting that people forget. The show certainly was sillier in that era and had much more of a celebrity news focus, but also had more of a local news parody focus. And this was a big difference when Jon came in two ways. Jon, interestingly to me, never had a master plan, never had a blueprint of here's what I want the Daily Show to be, but he knew he wanted it to, in his phrase, punch up, that he wanted to take on targets of, people who were in power, people who actually made the world work or not. So he wanted to get away from the local news. He wanted to get at politicians and mainstream media.
When you say local news, there'd be like some guy raising 17-foot pumpkins and they would make fun of it.
Yeah.
And
a guy who replaces his teeth with driveway gravel, and it could be very funny but kind of mean-spirited at times.
So why did, going into, and even Jon Stewart even refers to it several times, both in his introduction to the book, which is kudos to you. You got Jon Stewart to write the introduction to the book, and in the interviews. He basically says he felt like this was his last chance, or as he put it, the president of show business would fire him.
Yeah, and you do fascinating work on people's lives and career choices. And yes, at that point, Jon had worked hard on his MTV show, for instance, but now
how do you get over the disappointment of he failed repeatedly?
Yes, but it certainly hurt and it knocked him down for a while. But he's a really interesting cat in the sense that he's always kept in mind, if I keep doing good work, it'll work out. If I go out and keep making my stand-up better, good things will happen.
So maybe he had a sense like the back door, just in case none of these talk shows or TV shows or movies work out, the back door is I'll be a great stand-up headliner and tour the country and make a lot of money that way.
Yeah, and he had some disappointments. He went after and didn't get picked. Conan O'Brien, got picked for the job that Jon didn't get in late night. So Jon said, all right, well, I'm going to go and learn from other people. Shandling, the Sanders Show. While in retrospect seems like great preparation for what Jon ended up doing on The Daily Show, he went there to learn from smart and funny people like his friend Judd Apatow, who was,
was a writer for Shandling.
Yeah.
For the Larry Sanders Show. Now, let me ask you about that, because the Larry Sanders Show wasn't really a talk show. It was just a fictional show about a talk show.
Yes.
So it's not like you learn the talk show business by being on that show. You learn maybe the screenwriting business, or you learn the HBO style of sitcom, but it was a sitcom. It wasn't a talk show.
Yeah, and Jon, it's, sadly, I could show you, I had poster boards on my wall of the hundreds of people I wanted to interview, and Shandling was there, next. And unfortunately, we lost him, I guess, about a year ago now.
Yeah.
And
but you got Judd Apatow, which is a huge get.
Right. But Jon Stewart talks a great deal about what he'd learned pro and con from Shandling. The key thing, as Jon describes it, he picked up from Shandling in that Larry Sanders experience was intent, point of view. What is it we're trying to have this scene or this joke communicate? And it was also, as it turned out, a great lesson for Jon in how to manage people and not manage people. Judd Apatow talked to me about how in his Larry Sanders experience, he would sit in his lunch break and read books on management because there was so much, in Judd's view, going wrong and so much unhappiness
On the
behind the
Larry
scene
Sanders Show?
on Larry. Yeah.
Why is that? Because again, I
Gary
think
could be a tough guy to work with.
Gary Shandling.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Brilliant, no question.
Look at the platform for talent that developed there. I mean, everybody from Judd Apatow,
Yeah.
Bob Odenkirk,
Yeah.
who was already a talented comedian beforehand, but
Yeah.
kind of really picked it up on the Larry Sanders Show. Jeffrey Tambor, I never heard of before the Larry Sanders Show, and has become huge since he's still huge.
Fantastic, yeah.
I mean, Arrested Development became one of the greatest shows. All of Judd Apatow's work has been great.
Yeah.
Bob Odenkirk, of course, Breaking Bad and Better Than Saul.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of things went right with the Larry Sanders Show.
No question. And, John took a lot from that experience and imported it to when he got to The Daily Show. Chiefly among it, everything went towards the show being funny, certainly The Daily Show. But John also wanted to create a place where the staff got along, where the staff functioned, where there wasn't the kind of toxicity that you often get in sitcoms or late night show environments.
Well, I still don't understand, I think of a sitcom or a late night show as just a fun, funny environment. Maybe there's a certain stress, like you have to come up with 20 new jokes a day.
Yeah.
So that could be stressful and needs to be managed from the top down. But what's the toxicity that, as you put it, often appears there?
Well, it's, showbiz, and not to be cliche or stereotype, but you've got, in many cases, a lot of ambitious, competitive, eccentric people. And you put them in a room and give them a deadline, and that can, lead to a lot of clashes. And one of the things people make fun of about Jon Stewart in the book, people who worked with him at The Daily Show, is he would wear the same thing in the office every day. A pair of work boots, a pair of chinos, same T-shirt, same Mets hat. And while they, rag him about essentially being a slob, there was, not to get cheaply psychological, also something John was communicating in that he was simplifying a lot of the extraneous stuff and getting to work. He was showing up at 9 every day, ready to work.
It wasn't about, quote unquote, the trappings of show business. It was about, today is today, and what was in the news, and what's funny about it, and what's our point of view, and so on.
Exactly.
And initially, it wasn't quite about that. I mean, he still had to deal with kind of the leftovers from the Craig Kilborn Daily Show. And again, not to take away from what Craig built there, it was just a different show. But when did John start having the courage to say, hey, my style of comedy is different. I need to start expressing a different kind of comedy?
Yeah, almost really definitely before he started officially. He came to the Daily Show offices, met with the writers that he was going to inherit from the Kilborn staff. And the dynamic in the Kilborn years was very, very different. Craig essentially would come in and read from the prompter, which gave the writers and a couple of producers a huge amount of autonomy to create the show.
But Craig also seems like, and this is a positive thing, he seems like crazy and funny enough that he would want to participate in defining the humor of the show.
Yeah, somewhat.
Like you described to me you didn't describe to me, the book described to me, so I'm saying
Sure.
You described his interview with MTV and his joke about that was a joke about Downtown Julie Brown, and it's a very dangerous, brave joke to say in an interview to do a TV show. So it sounds like just off the top of his head, he's saying, I'm going to be crazy. Why didn't he take a more active role in managing the writers of The Daily Show?
I don't think it's something he, without talking to him, it's hard to say. It's, informed speculation, talking to all the people who worked with him. That wasn't what he was interested in. He was interested more in the performance aspects of it than the vision, than the creation of the show. So when John comes in, who does have a real point of view, who, for the personal reasons we talked about, feels like this, if not a last chance, is something he really deeply cares about making work, he's going to take control of everything. He's got a lot of experience as a writer himself, and he got a tremendous amount of pushback from the inherited writers who felt like, this is our show, we're succeeding. John laid down the law in a couple of, profane meetings that got leaked to Page 6 about, I'm in charge here. If you don't want to be here, fine, leave.
But that also strikes me as interesting that there would be that kind of conflict, because obviously nobody would say to Letterman or Leno or Jimmy Fallon, hey, this is the way we do things at late night. You better follow along. I mean, if Letterman says, no, do it this way, they're going to do it that way. They're going to at least try it.
Yeah, well, but you got to remember the Jon Stewart of 1988, 1999 is not the Jon Stewart of 2016.
Right.
So Comedy Central, even in those days, when Jon came in, was still somewhat of a sketchy proposition. Cable, and this is one of the threads that I hope comes through in the book, how much the media world had changed over that period of time. So both because of the internal dynamics, the writers not wanting to give up the power that they had, and the external dynamics that, it's cable, nobody's really paying attention to what we're doing anyway, and Jon feeling like this is a last chance, I got to make this good.
Well, it's so funny you say that, because the number of, and this is how basic cable then compares to podcasting now, almost as many people will listen to this podcast as watched Craig Kilborn's The Daily Show.
That's wild to think about.
I mean, if Jon Stewart made The Daily Show, put it to a whole new level, but that's a very special case.
Yes.
I mean, I still don't know if cable channels in general they don't get the views that The Daily Show now currently gets.
Right. And, I describe it in the book. It was a media environment where, when Jon took over, where the big three nightly newscasts, ABC, CBS, NBC, they were still pulling in 30 million viewers totally.
Like how many viewers
So
were?
the world, we forget too, just as The Daily Show launched in 96, Fox News launches, MSNBC launches, and those became huge foils in the life of The Daily Show.
So looking at the environment, it seems like there's three things happening. One is there's Jon Stewart's kind of evolution as a comedian and his continuing stand-up and so on. The other is you have all these new news shows that are going to have their own late-night offerings covering the news as they see it with their own point of views. Fox had a point of view, MSNBC had a point of view. And then you have Leno and Letterman competing for late night. So did Jon go in there saying, I need to differentiate myself, or did he go in there saying, I need to be, I'm Letterman-esque, so I need to be like Letterman but better?
Yeah, not quite. I mean, more, these are the things I care about. I care about the politics of the world. I care about the media. And then he got handed a gift, essentially, as he's shifting the show in a more substantive direction. You get the 2000 presidential campaign.
As he called it, Indecision 2000.
Exactly.
And that's when they started kind of making it look almost like a real news show covering the news. As opposed to just, like you say, the local news.
And, it's inside baseball maybe, but it's fascinating. Jon hired people specifically away from producers, away from 60 Minutes, away from ABC News, to give the show more of that look of a nightly evening newscast.
Well, it's funny. So you say he hired people away from there. Did he also try to hire people away from Leno and Letterman?
No, because those were still the big leagues, and Daily Show, Comedy Central at that point didn't have that kind of juice.
But he must have been hiring for comedy, because, look, you don't get a Steve Carell and a Stephen Colbert from ABC News. He hired them away from the Dana Carvey show, which was amazing. If you look at the Dana Carvey show, Dana, at least particularly at that time, was a well-known, talented comedian from SNL and movies and everything. And look at the staff on that show.
Oh, my God.
Louis C.K.,
the writers,
Steve Carell, Stephen Colbert. Who else was on that show?
The writers were, I'm blanking on the names, a bunch of guys who went on to write for The Simpsons, for news radio.
So why wasn't that show successful?
I didn't do enough homework. I don't know. Maybe it was ahead of its time, but it certainly had the talent to be really great.
Well, you wonder, but again, when Letterman and Leno were first going head to head, there was also Chevy Chase was trying to go head to head with them. So just because someone's talented and a funny guy doesn't mean they're going to put in the work to be an everyday talk show host.
And it's important to remember too, in that period of time, political humor for Letterman, for Leno, was 2 minutes of the opening monologue, right? Or they'd have a politician on and do a fairly friendly interview. The space that Jon Stewart and The Daily Show came to occupy was wide open because, again, we have MSNBC, Fox, and even more important, CNN, particularly with the first Gulf War, demonstrating that there was a real audience for news coverage in late night. And Jon going after it in a way for 22 minutes a night, as opposed to Leno or Letterman doing some, throwaway Monica Lewinsky kind of jokes. That was open territory. He didn't strategize it that way. It was more, what Jon cared about himself and thought would be funny.
But let's look at it in terms of strategy, almost from an entrepreneurial point of view. So he's going up against two heavy hitters at late night, not to mention, I guess Nightline and heavy hitters on the news side. You kind of have to have an approach as an entrepreneur in a startup. Am I going to try to get everyone as my customer, or am I going to, there's a saying, if I try for everyone, I get nobody. And it seems like I'm going to borrow now from Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, who, Peter Thiel created PayPal, was an investor in Facebook. Peter Thiel basically says, find the niche where you can be a monopoly, and that's how you win.
Yeah.
And then you scale that. And it sounds like that's what Jon Stewart did.
Well, less Jon himself than a couple of executives at Comedy Central who should really get credit. Doug Herzog, who's still there at Viacom, was president of Comedy Central at the time. Michelle Gainless, whose title back then exactly I don't remember. But the Kilborn show originally was on at 11:30 at night. So it was going head-to-head with Letterman and Leno and couldn't compete.
Right.
And Bill Maher left Comedy Central, and they shifted it to 11 o'clock so that they were going up against local newscasts instead of the big guys in late night. So that came to help Jon Stewart as well. And the other thing...
Well, why did that help Jon Stewart?
Because there was no comedy shows on nationally at 11 o'clock at night.
Okay.
He had even less. His competition was the late local news, not Letterman, Leno.
You talking about Jon Stewart or Bill Maher?
Primarily Kilborn, then Jon Stewart.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other point you make there is something that was really brought home to me in a smart way by James Poniewozik, who was for years Time Magazine's TV critic, now the New York Times TV critic, wrote a lot of smart things about The Daily Show over the years. But he talked about how The Daily Show and Jon Stewart anticipated in many ways exactly the kind of niche appeal that you're touching on, that what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years as the major networks have lost audience, as cable and the internet have come on the scene and taken over, essentially, is that appealing to that interest group, the narrower interest group, rather than appeal to everybody across the board, is often a lot more successful. And Jon, in an intuitive way, did that. It wasn't something he set out to do.
Let's stop to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking
fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com.
You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So, I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy.
The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get 2 memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply.
Let me play the devil's advocate for a second, because sometimes when you go for the smaller audience and you lose badly. So a great example being Al Gore's, or was it Al Gore or Al Franken, the radio network that Al Franken
Air
engineered.
America.
Yeah, Air America.
Right.
So they tried to have that point of view too. And Al Franken is a funny guy. I mean,
Tremendous,
his books
yeah.
are great. Saturday Night Live, he was great. I don't know if he's still funny as a senator, but that was the most boring radio network I ever listened to.
Right.
So like he couldn't compete with the, for better or for worse, the Howard Sterns, the Rush Limbaughs, the people with extreme points of view on the right. What separated Jon Stewart out from Air America?
Probably timing for one thing. Second, and maybe more
What do you mean?
important, Air America, I forget exactly when they debuted, but they might have been a little ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm.
John coming in as host in 99, 2000 was perfectly suited for the bizarreness of what turned out to be the George W. Bush, Al Gore campaign and recount.
I think also Jon Stewart's style is a little bit is not as fervent as like an Al Franken or a Janeane Garofalo.
Exactly. And that's where
He would be like perplexed on the screen more.
Yes. He had a more of a connection, and this is something Liz Winstead says in the book, that John became sort of the voice of the audience, which was stumped or perplexed or horrified by what was going on in the political world. The Air America folks, they came at it, rightly because of who and what they were trying to do. They came at it with much more of a political agenda. For John, and there's endless debates about this, and it changed over time somewhat. John cared about it being funny first and foremost, not pushing a political line.
But I think the first and foremost is important, because I think Al Franken wanted to be funny too, but also was pushing an agenda. I think that was his first, was the agenda.
Yes.
Because he saw this possible future in politics in front of him. I'm just guessing. I don't know. And then, but with Jon Stewart too, you said something that was interesting, which is that he was the voice of the audience. In some ways, what made him funny here is he let the show be funny rather than himself be funny. So he would outsource kind of the comedic elements to like a Steve Carell or a Stephen Colbert, kind of the initial newscasters in the field.
Right.
Steve Carell would be clueless,
right,
reporting on something very important, and Jon Stewart would again be just the voice of the audience.
Yeah.
Like, wait, Steve, are you sure you really mean that? And then let Steve Carell be funny.
Yeah. And and Colbert, Bee, Carell, Oliver, but particularly early years folks talk a good deal in the book about how John gave them the space to figure out those characters, those correspondent characters for themselves. And they came out of improv backgrounds, which was hugely helpful to what they were trying to do.
All of them. I think all of them came out of like Second City, basically, or the Upright Citizens Brigade.
Exactly. And, John, over the years, took a greater hand in constructing the field pieces. But early on, he let those guys, and there's a story I love. This is a real turning point in the life of the show, both in it getting attention in the outside world and internally finding the tone that John wanted. Steve Carell did a famous piece on the Straight Talk Express bus with John McCain in the 99 campaign. And he asked a series of really softball questions, what kind of tree would you be, that kind of thing. And McCain, who's got a sense of humor, plays along. And then Carell asks a policy question. He says, you're a strident opponent of pork barrel spending, yet when you headed the Senate Commerce Committee, you dedicated more money to individual districts and pork barrel projects than anyone in history. And McCain freezes. There's a real deer in the headlights moment, which Carell bursts by saying, oh, I don't even know what those words mean. And they go back to laughing. Two things about that I found really interesting. Carell and the producer, Nick McKinney, brother Mark McKinney, if you want to get into, the trivia weeds from Kids in the Hall.
Okay.
And anyway, McKinney and Carell found that question in Time magazine on the way to the shoot. So as much preparation as they put into it, it was a last-minute thing that ended up being a turning point in the life of the show. And the tone part of it is that it was a mix of journalism and comedy that nobody else had really nailed before in late night, that they could get access and put politicians on a spot in a way, but then had to pull back from it because they were essentially a comedy show.
Well, okay, in that part, I highlighted that exact story in the book. Because what if he did not pull back from it? So obviously it's really funny. Like, I don't even know what those words mean anyway, and that's on camera, I assume. I didn't see the episode. I just read it in the book. What if he didn't pull back from it? What if he said, "This is a serious question"? That's kind of funny too.
It is.
Maybe not as funny. Was this a humor decision or a show decision or a political decision?
In the moment, it was Carell's decision. It's his improv skills.
Because I want to know the answer to that question.
Exactly. More big picture, it was a show decision that, they weren't a gotcha show. They weren't journalism. They never were going to be.
But I feel like Jon Stewart in the later years did become a gotcha show. And he would find the humor more. He would be more angered by the hypocrisy rather than just like try to make it into something funny.
Yeah, and that's an evolution in the life of the show. And in Jon, he talked to me about how, just ingesting all this cable news and political hypocrisy over the years, it builds up in your system. If you care, if you think deeply about this stuff, it makes you mad. And over the years, as the tragedies built up, he became, not that he was ever guarded, but he became less reluctant to just express that full out.
So that was one key evolution, which is that suddenly The Daily Show was recognized enough to have access to even ask questions to McCain.
Right.
And you had talents like Steve Carell and Stephen Colbert and so on, use their intelligence to create this interesting comedy. And Jon Stewart kind of, again, almost outsourcing the comedy to them while he was the voice of the audience. What would you say is the next evolution?
That once they're on the radar of both the political world and the political media world, having gotten access to some of those people, Jon kind of backpedaled from it. He realized that getting interviews with politicians, though they continued to do that over the years, and media figures, was less interesting than standing back and having a little distance. So they happened upon, in some ways, because they didn't have access initially in the 2000 conventions in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, they thought, all right, we'll just get some background footage, stock background footage of crowds or monuments or whatever, and we'll project that on green screen. And we'll have the correspondents instantly, they can be in Baghdad or they can be in Austin, Texas. And they realized that they could punch at people in all sorts of ways by not having them right in front of them. And Jon thought that was freeing, that they weren't chasing people for access. They were just pretending that they had access.
So as opposed to, like, let's say, a Letterman or a Leno or now a Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon, where a lot of the show is about who you can get on. Like, Jennifer Lawrence has a new movie coming out. Let's get Jennifer Lawrence on. And then you have to be careful about how much you make fun of the situation because you need the next guest.
Exactly. And, Jon, he cared about ratings, and he wanted to talk to powerful people, and, over the years had a real parade of them on the show.
Barack Obama on 7 times.
Yeah, and, from their end, from the politicians' end, what's going on there. The Daily Show with Jon Stewart had one of the most politically engaged younger male audiences that a lot of politicians have trouble reaching, so they wanted to go on the Daily Show, whether it was a campaign year or in between, to try to reach those folks.
And on the one hand, you can argue, a president or a presidential candidate going on a comedy show is a little bit frivolous, but there was a precedent with Bill Clinton doing the sax on Arsenio Hall.
Right.
So he kind of opened the gates for that.
Yeah. So, the next sort of turning point, I guess, would be in 2004, where the show's been winning Emmy Awards now, right, for several years. The show's been getting great ratings. The show's been getting great press coverage. And
and I have a question about this year. So people were he was in a big transition point, and a lot of writers were joining or pitching. What would you would say a writer would submit a packet of stories?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, selfishly, from the point of view of someone who is a fan of comedy, likes it, I'm sort of envious of all the people who grew up working in it. What does that mean? What does a submission packet look like for the Daily Show back then?
Yeah, I mean, it's stayed fairly consistent over the years. What they would do if somebody was interested in applying to write for the Daily Show, they would write 5 or 6 segments that they thought would fit on the Daily Show.
Like what's an example segment?
Of their own choosing. I mean, you, me, whoever was applying, they would say, okay, or they wouldn't even, the Daily Show wouldn't even give them this direction at this point. You, the writer, would, do a 5-minute spec segment about, Trump having a meeting with Kanye West, okay? And you'd do another one about, Hillary Clinton walking through the woods and bumping into people, after she's lost. So you would try to find things that you could see working on the show. And if the writers and producers thought you'd done a decent job, they would then, the Daily Show would then, in the next round, give you, the applicant, 2 or 3 topics, okay? Write about the war in Syria. And here's all the clips and all the written research material that we might use for a segment. But you have 24 hours now to turn this around.
Because those might become real segments.
Exactly. But to try to simulate as closely as possible what it means to be a writer on the show. That stuff, you show up at 9 o'clock in the morning and you have to have turned it around by 4 o'clock in the afternoon the same day. So your second packet would be 2 or 3 of those subjects that the Daily Show producers gave you, along with the backup material, and then you had 24 hours to turn it in.
And so 2004 transition.
Yeah. To finish that, so the Daily Show's picking up all this momentum, and people are saying they're the greatest thing in comedy and late night and so on. And not that Jon kidded himself that he was going to sway any election ever, but the fact that Bush had screwed up the Iraq War to that point, and Kerry still lost, hit them hard at the Daily Show. Like, a lot of people still don't think the way we do. And again, Jon found that freeing.
But also he didn't want to. I mean, he made fun of John Kerry also. Like,
yes.
He didn't want to have 100%. Again, it's different from Air America. He didn't want to have 100%. We believe in this point of view.
Right. Though the interview he did with Kerry in the studio that year during the 2004 campaign was a notorious swing and miss that Jon admits to me and everybody else he should have been tougher on Kerry. But Kerry losing, Bush being around for another 4 years, really sort of energized Jon to take things on in a more full-throated policy way. They at that point had seen 4 years of the sort of Bush propaganda spin operation, and were kind of angry that they had to deal with another 4 years of it.
Right, and it seemed like at that point was when technology is sort of catching up, where they can kind of take video clips really quickly from multiple stations, edit them together, turn them around, so the hypocrisy was more underlined. So rather than Jon just simply saying, these guys said this, these guys said this, these guys said, they're actually showing it over and over again, and that was funny.
Yeah, you touched on a piece that ran in 2003 called Bush versus Bush, where they assembled video clips of candidate Governor George W. Bush versus now President George W. Bush talking about intervention and nation building and Iraq, and just direct contradictions, and in those days it took them 6 weeks and stacks of VHS tapes to piece that together. Eventually, one of the producers said, "Hey, there's these things called TiVo. We really should buy some," and they did, and that sped things up to one degree. What was interesting, even now, as the technology has evolved to something, a software company called Snapstream, that's essentially, Google mixed with a VCR. You can punch in a phrase and it'll instantly find you a dozen clips of some politician.
I wonder how now it seems like they get like 30 clips, one after the other, and then they edit that together into one big clip.
Well, they anticipated in some ways that technology and improvised it on their own, and it caught up with them in about 2010 is when Snapstream came out online for The Daily Show.
But the Bush versus Bush segment was funny because so essentially, like you were saying, it showed Governor Bush saying one thing about isolationism and we're not here to nation build, and then President Bush saying we're going to nation build in Iraq. So again, Jon Stewart could have pointed that out as hypocrisy, but that wouldn't have been funny, and it would have been too strident.
Yeah.
And I read in one book, maybe it was the Hidden Tools of Comedy. I don't know if you've looked at that book, but he describes comedy as sort of the truth but missing something. So you're kind of like, so in this case, the truth is, the funny part is the fact that these two versions of Bush are saying different things. The part that's missing is Jon Stewart pretending he doesn't know that these are the same person.
Yeah.
He's acting as if they're two different people. He's missing the knowledge. You remove knowledge from the situation, and that's what made it funny.
No, that's a hugely important point. And the other thing, which is somewhat related, is Jon and key people early on like Ben Carlin, who was head writer and then executive producer, David Javerbaum, head writer, then executive producer, as good as they are as writers of jokes, always remembering they were working in a visual medium. That we need a clip to go with this. We need a graphic to go with this. That it can't just be Jon lecturing at the desk.
Although Jon is a great performer.
Right.
So he had he's 1,000 facial expressions. Like he was able to express a lot of different comedy with his face.
Right.
But he still needed that extra, we're a television show, effect.
Yeah. And so, over the years, to keep himself amused, to keep trying to do different things, would not do impressions so much as voices, and famously these extended parodies of Glenn Beck, where he, put on smart guy glasses and had these wacky diagrams on chalkboards and puppets descending from the ceiling. That was partly just to play on what Beck was doing at the time, but also to keep, Jon himself amused.
Now, was he, where was his skill set as a comedian? Was he talented at impressions? Was he writing his jokes? Where did he come in?
He's a tremendous joke writer. He's terrible at impressions, as Elliott Kalan, who was a longtime staffer, had just about every job you could have from intern to head writer at the show. At one point in the book, Elliott says, Jon's voices are Southern guy, Italian guy, Jewish guy, other Jewish guy. And that's about the extent of his range. So, the lameness of Jon's voices and impressions in and of itself became a joke that he would play around with.
Well,
his main skills are as a writer and as a rewriter. And this is something, I don't know if it comes through in the book, and it sounds like I'm patting myself on the back or something, but the show we all saw for 22 minutes a night on TV was funny and smart and really polished because you had all the clips and all the correspondence. In some ways, the better, to me, more interesting show took place in a windowless room in the hour between rehearsal and taping. They would do rehearsal to an empty studio just to crew members. Jon would run through all the bits, cross out things he didn't think worked, ask for different clips. Then they'd go into this windowless room, and Jon, on some nights, would rewrite 50 to 75% of the script on the fly.
Well, that comes through actually quite a bit in the book, and there's one note where one of the writers, in between rehearsal and the performance, apologizes to Jon Stewart because the rehearsal was so bad, and Jon Stewart says, "What am I?" And the writer said, "A professional." And Jon's like, "That's right, I'm a professional." And he would go in there and rewrite. So it's very interesting he brought up that word professional, because I just interviewed for this podcast another writer, Stephen Pressfield, who wrote a book called Turning Pro about what it means to be a professional, no matter what your profession. But for him, it was as a writer. What is a professional for Jon Stewart?
Wow. To him, it was, somebody who didn't get distracted, who kept the focus on the core elements of the show, that it had to be funny, that it had to be factual, that there's a researcher who I describe in the book, a guy who's brilliant, who's been there from the Kilborn days, is still there now with the Trevor Noah show, who says that on his tombstone he wants it to read, "The jokes don't matter if the facts are wrong."
Is that Alex?
Adam Chodikoff.
Yeah, Adam, yeah.
Brilliant guy.
Apparently he had the super memory for I heard Bush say this 5 years earlier.
He's a beautiful mind kind of guy. And Jon very much was of that philosophy and ethos as well.
Well, you bring up a great point about points of view versus comedy. So there was one time, I think it was Jon Stewart saying this, or maybe you wrote this. I forget which voice this was in the book. Newt Gingrich falling, they could maybe make a joke about,
right,
but there's no point of view. It's not about anything.
Exactly.
And, and Newt Gingrich's a random Republican, could have been a Democrat too. But Jon Stewart needed that point of view to combine that with the funny.
Yeah, and he and everybody else are playing that they didn't find that every night. There were lots of nights they failed, but that was always the goal. And to go back to the professional point for 1 second, the other element that was crucial in Jon's makeup as a human being, but in his agenda setting at the show, was that however much external praise they got, however many awards they won, that stuff, in Jon's view, went away very quickly. That he and the show had to stay focused on, did we do what we thought was the best possible show we could do tonight? And you control your intention, but you can't control a reaction.
Do you believe that there is such a thing as fear of success?
Wow, my psychology credentials have expired. I'm not
Are you
equipped.
a psychologist?
No.
All right, good.
No.
I had a lot more questions for you. If you were.
I'm not equipped to answer that. As a person, sure. I can't back it up with any kind of...
Because I imagine going into an Emmys and doing a show that's of that quality and then winning awards, that could be pretty scary, because then you've got to be better. You've got to, and Jon Stewart, it sounds like he was able to reinvent himself to be better. So he wasn't just, at first, again, he was doing kind of the news in a funny way. Then he was exposing the hypocrisy of the people involved in the news in a funny way. Then I think the next reinvention occurred in 2009 when, okay, now we've got Barack Obama. So he then started focusing on the hypocrisy of media itself.
Yes.
Which was an interesting turn.
Yeah. I mean, and it was reactive to what was going on in the world, and certainly the Republicans and Fox News trying to obstruct Obama at every turn, that became a major narrative at The Daily Show. But, Jon, while he talks about trying to put aside all that external feedback and praise, don't kid yourself. He's got an ego. He's in show business. He cares about this stuff. The fact that he had a voice in the discussion, and particularly when you get to 2009, the Obama White House cared what Jon Stewart was saying, both as a marker of what they thought, liberal opinion was out there in the world, and as a driver of that opinion. So Jon, used that small influence narrowly in only a couple of instances, but he was well aware and he enjoyed that he was being listened to at the highest levels.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I remember from the point of view of, in the financial crisis, I would speak regularly with Jim Cramer from TheStreet.com and CNBC, obviously. And I remember that day when Jim Cramer went on The Daily Show, and I had talked to Jim earlier, and then I had talked to him again at 3 a.m. that night over text.
Oh, wow.
And Jim's like, yeah, I'm just going on. We're going to have fun. And then he goes on, and Jon Stewart just eviscerates him. And I don't even think, I think Jon was kind of dead on in terms of this is the voice of America being outraged at the voice of financial punditry. He might not have gotten everything accurate, and I think Jim could have defended himself a little better. I think he just sort of lay down and let Jon hit him,
which infuriated Jon even more.
that could be. I mean, I think Jim was there to play nice,
right?
As, hey, we're both people who have succeeded in our industries. Let's be nice to each other,
right?
But I think Jim had for years dedicated himself to trying to help people out financially.
No question.
He just had everybody was wrong during the financial crisis. It wasn't anyone's. It might have been politicians' fault, or there's lots of places to blame, but it probably wasn't some TV show on CNBC's fault.
Yeah, there's a lot of threads there. It's a couple of points. It's fascinating to me. I was talking about how much over the years structure Jon created at The Daily Show. Beyond just we have a meeting at 9 o'clock and we have another meeting at noon and scripts are due at 2 and rehearse at 4. I mean, there's that sort of skeleton schedule that you needed to have and enforce. But the larger, everything's got to have a point of view. Everything's got to have a vision. But within all that, he left a lot of room for luck and initiative and improvisation. It fascinated me that as much as they were recording day in, day out on TiVo, they also depended in a lot of their what became most famous segments on producers and writers just stumbling across stuff.
What?
Well, there was a bit where Sean Hannity using a totally misleading crowd shot to make it look like Glenn Beck's rally on the Mall in Washington. I mean, they used a piece of footage from a totally different rally to make it look like it was and that was something that Elliott Kalan just happened across watching CNN one afternoon on his own. Another producer, who shall remain nameless, liked to get high on Saturday nights and just watch hours of Hannity. and out of that came a bunch of the bits that they did about Sean Hannity. And
what were some bits? Like, what was a funny bit?
The Hannity ones are escaping me, but the point that I'm coming back to was the most damning piece of videotape that they used against Cramer during the studio interview was from his Street.com show.
Oh, I remember I was standing outside the room when he was filming that one. That was the one with a friend of mine who I won't name. He was interviewing Jim, and Jim was talking about how hedge funds would, somewhat manipulate the markets. He wasn't saying necessarily it was a gray area he was talking about.
Yeah.
But Jon took the specific points that really seemed the most damning,
right,
and played it.
Yeah.
And I think Jim really was caught off. It was the deer in headlights thing.
Yeah.
But now Jon wasn't backing off. Like, there was no more backing off in The Daily Show.
Right. And that was a piece of tape that one of the writers who just decided, oh, I'm going to, go fumbling around with Google and see what I can find, came across. It wasn't some mandated, search for we've got to assemble every Jim Cramer clip for the past 5 years.
Right.
And they would regularly just stumble across things that ended up becoming good Daily Show bits.
So it's great then. So essentially what Jon did was it's almost like this Andy Warhol factory. Like he was a talented artist / comedian, but
who was very much in charge.
Very much in charge, but he had immense talent around him, ranging from Ben Carlin, who was his head writer and then I guess executive producer,
Right.
and then of course the Steve Carells, the Stephen Colberts, then later Ed Helms. So he had all these talents, and he sort of, where do you think he learned? It's not an easy management skill to let all of these super talented people who could just as easily do your job, let them do their thing.
Yeah.
How do you think was that a skill he had, or did he have to learn it the hard way, or?
Yeah, a lot of it appears to be innate. A lot of it, he talks about, comes from how he saw other people being treated on shows he worked on early in his career, how he was treated by either network executives or executive producers, and trying to do the opposite when it was him who was in charge.
So it seems like the opposite, and this is really interesting. Just as a discussion on management, it seems like the correct thing to do in management, at least in this case, and it seems to work in many cases, is cultivate your talent so that they realize that their talent is important to you, as opposed to their loyalty to your show.
Yeah.
So like Steve Carell, his talent was such that he eventually needed to go into movies and then do The Office.
Right.
Stephen Colbert's talent was such that he eventually needed to have his own show.
Right.
And Jon Stewart really pushed him when Colbert had doubts.
Yes, and this plays into all of what you're talking about, is that when people wanted to go off and do other things, performers wanted to do guest appearances on other shows or just wanted to leave and take their own show, Jon didn't stand in their way. I mean, he was very much encouraging of, that's great. You've done good work here, go and make your mark somewhere else. So he wasn't holding on to people beyond their desire to be at the show, which sets a good chemistry, I think.
Was there ever a time, though, when maybe, if you look at it in retrospect, it looks like The Daily Show had this straight up rise without any kind of volatility along the way. Like it didn't seem to ever fall. I mean, it won Emmys 13 seasons in a row, or 13 years in a row. So if you think if he wasn't the straight up rise, he would have been as free and easy, like, hey, yeah, you go off here because I know new talent will be coming in?
Yeah, probably not. It's a what if, but probably not. Though Jon came back to two things over and over again during his years at the show and in talking to me, and I'm going to paraphrase one of them badly, which is that he always felt in management the key thing was to have people invested in what they were doing without feeling ownership over it.
What does that mean?
That they cared, they put everything they had into it, and then they let it go in the writing, the producing, the performing, that the collective was more important than I wrote that piece or I performed that bit on the air.
So how would he deal with the fact that, essentially it was The Daily Show with Jon Stewart? So
Right.
his name
is on the building, on the show, yeah.
So how would he motivate people to feel invested? Because you can't get people to feel invested like, hey, invest in this so that my career could be better.
Right.
Like how did he kind of ascribe meaning to what these people were doing?
It sounds corny, but in just day-to-day ways, telling people, I loved that, you did a great job on that. Just the way he conducted himself day in, day out. He was the star of the show, no doubt about it, but he stood in the lunch line with everybody else every day. There was not a lot of pretension about the way he conducted himself.
Was there ever
there became a really internally difficult thing in 07, 08. There was a Writers Guild strike.
Mm-hmm.
not just The Daily Show, but across
Right.
the TV and film industry. And to that point, Jon had really considered himself one of the guys or gals, or, we're all in this together. We're a family. We're a team. And to some extent, the writers were saying at The Daily Show, but beyond that, of course, no, you're the boss, and we have some grievances here about pay and medical care and things like that we think should be better. And Jon was initially very defensive and angry about that he thought, not that he's opposed to unions in theory or in practice, but that, we'd all had this great run for all these years by all being in it together, and now you're saying we're not all in it together, that there's selfish motives or people have to look out for themselves. He ultimately came to realize they were right, that they probably should be paid more, and that they needed to make this point. And what his real problem was all the other staffers, the 75 or so people in the building who were not writers, who were not getting paid. So Jon, and here's another example of, how do you invest people and make them feel part of it? Jon went into his own pocket to pay a lot of those staffers over the course of the strike.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's obviously extremely motivating. And then the flip side of it is he also, goes on the lunch line. He's wearing a T-shirt and jeans or whatever, khakis. There's also this higher meaning to the show, which is we're about exposing the hypocrisy in the media.
Right.
And no other show is doing this. So we're kind of the source of we have this higher meaning, this higher function, almost as kind of this fourth branch of checks and balances in the government, where the checks and balances on that fourth branch.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing that you can't really calculate it or write it down in a formula. But people at the show talked to me about how, they didn't feel self-important, like we're speaking truth to power, man, we're doing it. But they realized the show had an important voice, that they felt they were doing something more, not that they're running down, their friends who wrote for Kimmel or who wrote for Leno or Fallon or any of those people, because they're really talented, but that they felt like The Daily Show had weight in the culture that a lot of other places didn't. So that's what, and Jason Ross, who wrote some of those CNBC bits, who was at the show as a writer a long time, talked to me about how hard it was to learn to accept that Jon was going to rewrite much of your material. But the payoff was the show was almost always better when it got taped that night. And,
So you couldn't really resent.
Yeah, and that it had a life in the culture that you couldn't have gotten anywhere else.
So here's a question I always wonder about extreme successes like Jon Stewart. I also wonder this about, David Letterman, Jay Leno, many people. After a few years, let's say after like 5 or 6 years, he's already won a couple of Emmys. He maybe had a $10 million year at one point. I don't know what his financial arc was. At what point do you say, hey, I'm not going to, that's hard work putting on a 22-minute TV show every single day. That's like 5 a.m. till 10 at night of work.
Yep.
And he did it for 16 years, and he was already probably closer to the beginning than the end. He was already fabulously wealthy. At what point do you say, okay, I did it, I'm going to try something new? Instead, he just kept doing this. Why do you think he kept going with it?
I think as hard as the work was, he was having a lot of fun. He'd surrounded himself with smart, interesting people. He was making a show every night and getting, enormous feedback, both from this positive feedback from the studio audience and the TV audience that he had not ever found anywhere else in his professional life. He was being listened to in the White House. It's hard to trade that kind of gratification or influence.
So let me ask you this. Obviously, one of the reasons, or maybe the main reason you wrote this book is you've known Jon Stewart a long time. You follow The Daily Show through its entire arc. You write about TV and media. For someone listening to this who doesn't necessarily have that type of meaning and influence in their life, and they're wondering themselves, why do I keep going to work? What can they pull from this? How can they find, and maybe this is a stretch, like, you really intended to write about the history of The Daily Show, not write something which is people are gonna be motivated by Jon Stewart's story, but how can someone be motivated by what Jon Stewart did with The Daily Show?
It's not a sure thing. It's certainly not a promise, but I think the truth of what he knew early on or believed and continues to believe, that if you're doing good work, it'll eventually pay off. I mean, that's hugely
sort of
important.
compounds.
Yeah, that's if you're doing something you care about and doing it with all your heart and energy, that will eventually, be paid back.
And having a point of view,
Right.
As opposed to just doing something silly.
Yeah.
I think it also reminds me of Harold Ramis's comment, I stood next to the smartest person in the room. And Harold Ramis obviously stood next to Bill Murray, and they created Caddyshack and Ghostbusters and so on, and Stripes and all these great movies. What else? Cultivate the talent around you.
Yeah.
So
allow them
credit.
the freedom, give them the credit, to care about your internal sense of what's good and bad as opposed to an external sense. I mean, we've all had bosses, or we all have to, meet some kind of marks or standards or deadlines. You're not totally autonomous usually in your professional life. But Jon always tried to listen to what he thought was good or bad, not the critics, not the reviews, not the award shows.
I think also he was good at reinventing.
Mm-hmm.
So he took an initial show with the local news, started putting a more national spin, and then again, in the ways we discussed it, he seemed to reinvent pretty successfully every 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and he's got a couple of repeated metaphors in his experience of the show. He talks about the show being somewhat like a Mexican restaurant, okay, where we have these beans and we have this rice and we have this chicken and we have this avocado, and if we put it in this soft thing and wrap it up, we can call it a burrito, and if we put it in this crunchy thing, we can call it a taco. So he kept trying to find new ways. The rally to restore fear and/or sanity was both a reaction to what Glenn Beck had done and the paralysis in Washington government at that point in 2010. But it was also Jon just trying a different way to perform, to take the show outside of the studio and see what it would be like.
And then how did Jon himself improve his skills? Like, did he still try to do stand-up comedy in front of audiences? Was he watching a lot of comedy? I mean, obviously he was watching his own show and all the great comedians there, but how did he continue to improve?
He read all the books that the authors came on the show to talk about. So he learned about the world and different ways through the guests. He really cared about what they were saying and what they could bring. He did very little stand-up during his years at the show. I guess the majority or bulk of it would be when he would be at a charity event and do 10 minutes of stand-up.
White
or
House
something
Correspondents.
Like that. Exactly. And he just, he had, and this gets back to your other point, I think, he just had sort of a bottomless appetite for news and policy. Elliot Kalin, again, one of the head writers, was talking to me about how in the later years, often the writers would come in the morning and say, Obama lied about this, or McConnell did this ugly thing. And Jon would come in and be freshly outraged. Not that he's naive, but Jon seemed to have a reservoir of outrage and disgust at politicians doing the wrong thing that drove the show from beginning to end. And it's hard to tell somebody have that same kind of core value or outrage, but it's really what propelled Jon.
So how would he, let's take an Obama situation. How would he turn that outrage into comedy? Because that seems like a challenge. Like, look, we can both go on our Facebook feeds and see outrage all day long.
Yeah.
But it won't be funny.
Right.
It's just a bunch of people spitting at each other.
Right.
How do you turn outrage into comedy?
Here's sort of a long-winded answer that leads to one really good field piece they did. Jon, over the years, felt like, okay, I'm going to be making jokes about the war. I'm going to be making points about government policy. I should really know about it as much as I can. So he would read books. But he also started quietly, no fanfare, no cameras, no nothing. He would go to Veterans Administration hospitals and talk to soldiers about how's the government treating you, how's the war being conducted. So he really got to know those guys and see up close how badly the bureaucracy was treating soldiers who'd come home from Iran and Afghanistan and other places. Iraq, not Iran. We haven't invaded Iran yet. Give us a couple of years.
So again, though, even more outrage.
So,
how do you convert that to comedy?
Yes. So
disabled soldiers, limbless,
yeah,
not being treated right.
not a laugh riot.
Right.
But he would do some desk pieces. But he also greenlit a piece Samantha Bee did with a producer named Miles Kahn, who now works at Sam Bee's Full Frontal show, where they made a 8 or 9 minute mock detective movie where they took one veteran and tried to trace his paperwork through the Veterans Administration. And it was funny because they kept running into these ridiculous, roadblocks. But it was also moving because it gave you a sense of just how much this guy was trying to go through to get medical care. And that ended up shaming the Obama administration, the Veterans Administration, and changing a lot of those rules and regulations.
And so they actually did, this piece did affect change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was one element that came up in other pieces Jon did where, you could only go to a Veterans Administration office for treatment that I think was something like 90 miles in a straight line from where you lived. But nobody can generally drive a straight line. So if it was 92 miles on the freeway, because you had to take a circuitous route, that was the closest place. You couldn't get care there.
And so what would he show? Would he show someone being rejected there?
Yeah.
And how would they show that? How would they bring
the
the
maps
cameras in?
And they'd bring graphics into it to just demonstrate the absurdity of it.
Huh. That's okay. All right. So that's how you can get
you can
some
humor
funny
out of
aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so did you ever see him? So he's affected change in maybe government bureaucracy. Did you ever see him affect change in media hypocrisy? So let's say if there was like Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly or Rachel Maddow or whoever who he felt maybe was not always spinning both sides of the story, was just kind of maybe lying or saying only one side of the story. Did you ever see him affect change in any media outlets?
Well, I mean, loosely, I talked to people like Anderson Cooper, who's a terrific reporter at CNN, who would say that, you were always conscious in the mainstream media world of not doing things that would get you made fun of on The Daily Show. And inevitably you did, but so that was one sort of loose effect.
So there might be in everybody's mind, The Daily Show's watching this.
Exactly. I think he and the show were a whole lot less successful in moving, the mainstream TV media in particular away from, their infatuation with the horse race, the day-to-day of campaigns. But it's hard to point, to specific examples where he changed media behavior. I think even he would count that as a
because they had their brands. They couldn't it's not like suddenly Sean Hannity suddenly going to say, I'm going to be a liberal Democrat now, even though I'm on Fox or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's not happening.
So during the course of your career, you've obviously followed all of these people. You followed Jon Stewart. Did you ever feel like, I'm just covering them, I want to be them? Did you ever want to be on The Daily Show or write for it or?
No. In some fantasy world, sure. But one of the experiences of reporting and writing this book was I was doing, 4 or 5 interviews a day. And in every one of those interviews, I would be reminded how not funny I am, because whether it was a writer or a researcher or a performer on The Daily Show, they were just so much quicker and funnier. No, I guess in the looser respect, it's a frustration of journalism. I mean, if you're a big Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal or something like that, yeah, you can make an impact in the world. But the rest of us as journalists, we enjoy telling stories, but the kind of impact something like The Daily Show had from time to time, whether it was on Veterans Administration benefits or making the Zadroga bill, medical care for first responders permanent. I mean, I'm envious, of that kind of impact in the real world.
So it's interesting though, because you do write this book, and it's a great book.
Thank you.
The Daily Show, the book, an oral history. I highly recommend it because of all these things we discussed. Not only was it this amazing platform of talent, but it affected how we view the news. It affected how we view late night comedy. It shows the rise of Jon Stewart and how that kind of talent develops. So it was an inspiring story to read.
Thank you. And you reminded me of an interesting thing. We talked just a second ago about, did Jon change the media in any respect? I interviewed a correspondent named Dan Bacadal, who was only at The Daily Show for 2 years, and they were pretty unhappy years in his life. And
why?
He,
I remember
in
that,
his
but I don't
description,
remember him saying why.
Yeah, essentially, he kept waiting for a producer or Jon, and this is in Dan's own account, to explain to him how to do the job, that he was too much on his heels and, not seeking out his own subjects, not bringing his own take on the humor, and that, it's a very fast-moving place where Jon doesn't have a lot of time for instruction and leading people by the hand. So Dan, anyway, comes and goes in 2 years, but then has a really interesting perspective, I thought, looking back on what didn't work and why. But he also said that he didn't think that Bernie Sanders would have been possible if not for Jon Stewart. Now, that's a stretch. Obviously, there are a lot of things behind Bernie Sanders' support. But what he meant was, and he talks about in the book, that a generation of citizens grew up watching and listening to how Jon Stewart and The Daily Show deconstructed the media and politics. And that a lot of people in their 20s, early 30s look at the political game through that kind of lens. And I would extend it even a bit further, that there's a generation of reporters, again, 20s, early 30s, who grew up watching and listening to The Daily Show. And a lot of them did great work during the Trump-Clinton campaign of calling people on lies and bullshit and, not sticking to the sort of classic objective reporter perspective. Not that Jon and The Daily Show was their only influence. A lot of those people are good reporters all by themselves. But I think that's, part of what they grew up with is how Jon and the show deconstructed the press and politics.
So, and again, that's part of kind of claiming his niche, when he started, as opposed to being the big tent approach of a Jay Leno or even of potentially a Dana Carvey,
sure,
who tried to appeal to everyone but wasn't, in the Jay Leno category. So this is a stretch question. So I'll before I ask this question, I'm going to say, please buy if you ever watch even one episode of The Daily Show, or actually I'm even inspired by just the management techniques of Jon Stewart. This is a great book. It's phenomenal, the research you did. I would dread the thought of having to talk to 114, conflicting personalities in order to put together a book in 6 months. So I highly commend you for that. So I have a show. It's this podcast. What should I do to improve it? Now, you've probably only seen this one episode that we're on, but I'm always just curious. Like,
I've listened.
How should I think?
Listen to you talk to our mutual friend Stephen J. Dubner.
Oh yeah,
many
okay,
times. I don't know.
It's an interview show. It's like an interview format, but I could always play with format.
Yes, challenge yourself whenever possible. And again, I sound like I'm kissing ass, or I'm continually referring to the book of Jon Stewart, the Gospel of Jon Stewart, or something. But he talked, and in the book, a lot of the writers talk about, which is more important, Jon's advice that if you were writing a piece or addressing an issue and you found yourself getting uncomfortable, to steer into that. That if something wasn't working or it was just making you question why the world works this way, or just made you physically discomforted, you should keep pursuing that. Write that into the piece.
So, what's an example?
They were trying to figure out a way to do a segment about campus sexual assault. And, not on its face a laugh riot kind of piece. And the writers who'd been assigned to write it just were really squeamish about trying to make jokes about this deeply sensitive and difficult subject. And what they ended up doing was getting together a group of women, both writers and producers, staffers at the show, to talk among themselves about all the nasty shit they had to put up with in their day-to-day lives. And out of that, in going deeper into that discomfort, they ended up with a really funny and moving, in some ways, piece with Jessica Williams and Jordan Klepper as the correspondents. So that they cited to me as an example of, trying to follow Jon's instruction that this thing wasn't working, it was making them uncomfortable to work on it, go deeper into that discomfort rather than just walk away from it.
Well, it's interesting then, where's the line between a discomfort you should walk away from and a discomfort you should go deeper into?
Yeah, and not one that lends itself to easy explication or formula.
All right, well, Chris Smith, author of The Daily Show, the book, and oral history. By the way, also Jon Stewart wrote a great introduction about his own career and what he was facing when he started The Daily Show, and his sense of the accomplishment that it was. Thanks so much for...
And also about pie. Pie is a very important part of his introduction.
Pie? I don't know.
He talks about how his then girlfriend, now longtime wife, essentially talked him into taking the Daily Show job.
They had the pros and cons.
Yes,
I remember that.
Right. And if Jon felt that if he took the job, it would mean eating less pie and, trying to look better on camera.
And which he did. He did very successfully. You see now also the difference between the day he left and now.
Yeah.
Now it's like Letterman too. It's like now he's got the gray beard.
Oh, but see, I'll tell you this, which was not known as something new in the book. Jon talked to me how about for most of the 16 years that he did the show, he had brutal insomnia. He went long stretches where he was getting 2-3 hours sleep a night. He leaves the Daily Show August 2015. He's slept through the night, 8-9 hours ever since.
That's great because it's important for health.
Yeah, no kidding.
All right, well, again, thank you so much, Chris, for joining the show.
James,
great time.
Thank you.
For more from James, check out The James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network at jamesaltucher.com and get yourself on the free insiders list today.
Hey, thanks for listening. Listen, I have a big favor to ask you, and it'll only take 30 seconds or less, and it would mean a huge amount to me. If you like this podcast, please let me know. Please let the team I work with know. Please let my guests know. And you can do this easily by subscribing to the podcast. Probably the biggest favor you could do for me right now, and it's really simple. Just go to iTunes, search for The James Altucher Show, and click subscribe. Again, it will only take you 30 seconds or less, and if you subscribe now, it will really help me out a lot. Thanks again.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.